Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the 2020 R&D Management Symposium. It is my great honor to be introduced speaker, Professor Arora of Business Administration at the Foucault School of Business at Duke University. He's a prolific and highly respected scholar focusing on the economics of technology and technical change. Professor Arora's research has included the study of technology-intensive industries, such as software, biotechnology, and the chemical industry, and the role of patents and licensing in promoting technology startups. So of great interest to this theme today. His current research focuses on the management of intellectual property and licensing in corporations and innovation-based entrepreneurship. Today, he's going to talk about the changing structure of the American innovation ecosystem with reference to the changing role of the corporate research lab and the greater need for leadership from universities in both breakthrough invention and innovation. It is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Ashish Arora.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you, everybody, for joining in. Thank you particularly to the audience, some of whom are in different time zones. So first, I'd like to sort of acknowledge my colleagues and contributors on whose work I'm going to draw on: Professor Sharon Belenzon, Leah Shear, J.K. Sir at Duke University, and Andrea Pataconi of Norwich Business School. I also want to acknowledge a huge intellectual debt to my ex-colleague at Carnegie Mellon University, Professor David Hounshell, who first initiated me into the topic of corporate R&D, which is the subject of my talk today. And I do want to apologize that my talk today is about the American or the US innovation system. This is somewhat awkward for a talk to an international R&D management conference hosted by a Canadian university. I really have no justification, no excuse other than my own limitations. The American system is what I've studied and therefore what I will talk about. So this is the story of how the American innovation system has changed. I am not going to begin either at the beginning or the end, but in the middle, which is how I got into this project. And that is that large American corporations have been withdrawing from scientific research. Anecdotal evidence shows that famous corporate labs such as Xerox PARC, AT&T Bell Labs, and DuPont's Purity Hall have either been spun off or closed. A recent paper that I published with Sharon Belenzon and Leah Shear shows that the number of scientific publications per dollar of sales has approximately halved between 1980 and 2015. By comparison, as you can see on the red line, patenting has not declined. Now, we care about the decline of the large labs because they have been the source of groundbreaking technical innovations like the transistor, synthetic fiber, and lasers, but also because understanding why they have declined will also illuminate how innovation happens, how innovation is organized in the economy, and perhaps what may lie ahead for us. So to understand why corporate research has declined or corporate labs have declined, we return to the beginning to ask how it began. And for convenience, this is going to be divided into 4 parts, a century and a half into 4 parts. And I will go through these in order. So in the second half of the 19th century, the United States was on its way to becoming an economic powerhouse, but still well behind the scientific and technical frontier. Independent inventors were responsible for solving many of the problems that its enterprises face. If you see the graph on the right side, it shows the share of patents that were assigned, that is to say where the inventor sold the patent to somebody else. And you can see that over the 30-year period on this graph from 1870 to 1900, the line on the top, which shows the United States, remains well above the line, the dark line, which is Britain. And 2 points. One, there was a decline, so the independent inventor system was slowly in decline, but that it still remained a very important part of the U.S. Invention system. Now, these inventors were the source of the solution to many problems that the enterprises of the day faced. And these enterprises included some very large uh, and sophisticated ones, such as Andrew Carnegie Steel Mills in Pittsburgh and the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. Steve Usselman, who's a business historian from Georgia Tech, has studied and has shown how railroads, which are among the largest and most technically complex enterprises of their times, relied on outsiders and their own workers to solve the problems in production. There was an active market for technology, as I've shown, for example, for air brakes for a locomotive train, and firms hired technically qualified men to screen external inventions, to do quality control and troubleshooting. There are two examples that I think illustrate this point. The first is from Andrew Carnegie, speaking of how science came to be used in steel making. Quote, "We found a learned German, Dr. Frick, and great secrets did the doctor open up to us. Ore from mines that had a high reputation was now found to contain 10, 15, and even 20% less iron than it had been credited with. The good was bad and the bad was good, and everything was topsy-turvy. 9/10 of all the uncertainties of pig iron making were dispelled under the burning sun of chemical knowledge." What fools we had been. But there was this consolation. We were not as great fools as our competitors. Years after we had taken chemistry to guide us, they, that is the competitors, said they could not afford to employ a chemist. Had they known the truth then, they would have known they could not afford to be without one. The point being, initially, science was used for quality control, but also that there was systematic difference between steel makers. The second quote is in some ways even more interesting. It is from the head of the R&D department of AT&T in 1885. So in the middle of this period that I'm speaking about. This gentleman is called T.D. Lockwood, and he's the head of the R&D department. And he says, quote, "I'm fully convinced that it has never, is not now, and never will pay commercially to keep an established department, which is to say, that is the R&D department, should be first and foremost on examining patents or inventions submitted by the public for consideration, and second, on examining descriptions of inventions forwarded by the company's employees." The point here, just to repeat, is the American economy is already very rich. American firms are large and sophisticated in terms of the technical problems they face, but at this time, they prefer to rely on outside inventors and on their own employees, people engaged in production, to troubleshoot and to solve the problems for them. If you fast forward to 1940, and I'll backfill in just a minute, by 1940, some of the most admired firms had large research labs. David Hounshell, my colleague, has singled out DuPont, General Electric, Bell, and Kodak, which began to invest in research in 1900s, as the early 1900s, as the pioneers of corporate research. The success of these pioneers led other firms to emulate them in the 1920s, right through much of the Great Depression era. So how did this change come about when firms are relying on outsiders and the head of AT&T's research department says it'll never pay to do research internally? How did it come about that these firms changed their minds? Well, as you can imagine, the early attempts were very modest. The early R&D laboratories were very modest. If you look at the picture on the top left, that is the picture of the barn where GE Research Labs was started in 1901. And in 1921, you can see Einstein and others visiting GE Research Lab. And in the middle is Charles Steinmetz, um, who started GE Research Labs. In the graphs on the right, you can see the other part of the story, which is that universities in America were still well behind their European counterparts. Federal R&D, federal support for universities was very low, in fact, lower than the support that the universities got from their state governments. And one indicator of that is faculty at the leading American research universities of the day, as late as 1930s, would often get their PhDs overseas, either in Germany or in Britain. But just to get back to the story, the first research laboratories were founded in the early 1900s, GE in 1900, DuPont in 1902, AT&T in 1909, and Kodak in 1912. So the question was why? Well, there's a series of, or there's a set of factors that were important. First, there was lots of opportunity. There was a growing market unified by the telegraph, railways, and by laws. But there was also antitrust pressure that prevented the leading firms from simply buying their way to success. Growth had to come through technical advance. Now, traditionally, American firms had grown by importing foreign technology. But these low-hanging fruits had been picked by this time. And moreover, some of the American inventions, such as GE's incandescent light bulb, was being invented around by sophisticated European firms. An invention such as Lee de Forest's Audion had made long-distance radio a serious competitor to telephone lines. So if you were an AT&T, you had to think about how you would compete against the telegraph company. And there was growing demand. I'd already mentioned how rich America's economy had become. The automobile came around, which increased demand for refined petroleum, which in turn increased feedstocks for inventions like paints, lacquers, synthetic fiber, and plastic. Now, the important point is that not all firms saw the opportunities in the same way. Most firms remained focused on using existing scientific knowledge rather than producing new scientific knowledge. So if you compare two companies in the same sector, telecommunications, Western Union and AT&T, they have very different approaches. If you look at Western Union's scientific output, it's mostly about using existing science. A typical paper from Western Union reports on a survey of the safety issues involved when you co-locate electric and telegraph cable. AT&T, in contrast, at this time, is conducting fundamental research in physics, for which one of their scientists gets the Nobel Prize in 1937. One important reason for this difference in approaches that the firms had was where they were. Some firms had reached the technical frontier and believed that they needed to develop a fundamental understanding of the materials and the phenomena that they were dealing with. And given the weak state of American universities, they believed they had to do it themselves. They could not rely on universities to provide them with this fundamental knowledge. So what's an example of these bottlenecks? At GE, for example, one problem they faced was that light bulbs would blacken and fail. Now, they then invested in research, and Langmuir, who would get a Nobel Prize, found that this blackening was happening because electrons were being emitted from tungsten filament, which is the filament being used, in a vacuum. Now, what exactly was causing this? And how to solve this required, there were two ways. One could do a trial and error method, try different filaments, but instead what Langmuir did was he tried to understand the physical processes behind electrical discharges in vacuum and in gases. And this led him to the solution of replacing the vacuum inside light bulbs with an inert gas like argon. And his work on understanding how these electrons were reacting with the surface of the light bulb led him to his work on surface chemistry, for which he would win the Nobel Prize some years later when he discovered that molecular hydrogen introduced into a tungsten filament bulb dissociated into atomic hydrogen and formed a one thick layer on the surface of the bulb. Now, as you can imagine, this process of moving from trial and error, from using what was already known to trying to expand the frontiers of science itself was not smooth. And you can see it within GE itself. On the left, you have Edison, who's openly disdainful and of this newfangled approach and has a very pragmatic approach to invention or innovation. But Willis Whitney, who founded, who led GE's research lab, had a very different take. And you can see in his correspondence to Langmuir, he's saying, I'm not just interested in practical results. The lab will, of course, have to pay for itself, but in addition, it should make a contribution to the advancement of science and knowledge. So you can see here, the key period is when corporate philosophy changes, when the approach to thinking about how science is going to both lead to profits, but also has to be done, is a value in itself. This slide, which is a mural, which is a mural from DuPont's pavilion at the 1939 World's Fair, shows the changing role of corporate research or how it was being viewed. By the time World War II starts, corporate research is seen as a crown jewel. It's an object of pride and considerable PR. So corporate PR functions were promoting industrial scientists as heroes. And World War II, as we all know, was a defining event. It changed many things, including the role of research. The World War successes like the atomic bomb project, radar, penicillin, and the ENIAC computer solidified the belief in new knowledge as a source of progress. And on the right, you can see the front cover of Vannevar Bush's famous memo on Science, the Endless Frontier. Starting 1940s, this is a somewhat arbitrary classification, but certainly the post-World War II decades were the golden age of corporate research. Among corporate managers, there was now a much firmer belief that basic research would be the source of radical innovations. And this led the AT&Ts, the DuPont, the General Electrics, the RCAs, the Kodaks, and their followers to plan and execute a dramatic expansion of corporate research laboratories. Importantly, it also led military R&D planners, because this was also the early phase of the Cold War, to establish the Independent Research and Development Program, which allowed weapons contractors, defense contractors, to put aside a small percentage of their current contract value to invest in basic scientific and engineering research so as to remain on the cutting edge of the research frontier so that they could bid on the next weapon system. The IR&D program grew to such an extent that it significantly outstripped the budget of the National Science Foundation, which itself was growing. In fact, the IR&D program led military planners to insist that firms that had never had corporate research laboratories establish them and staff them with the best scientists they could. And this was the case with Boeing and with Sperry which were major suppliers to the military before and after World War II. This significant expansion of corporate research made significant, substantial contributions to advancing science. Bell Labs alone had 9 Nobel Prizes and 14 Nobel laureates for the research that was conducted in their labs. But in addition, there were also very substantial contributions to innovation itself. So from Bell Labs alone, you get solid state electronics and transistor, you have the laser, and you have cellular networks. And together, you get this, the iPhone. These are the 3 things that make the iPhone possible, or the mobile telephony possible. But of course, this was going to change. By the 1980s, companies began to withdraw from corporate research. David Hounshell tells the story of DuPont, and he describes how they kept searching for the next nylon, which was never to come. The graph on the left-hand side is based on science and engineering indicators from the National Science Foundation. It shows the share of basic and applied research in total business R&D. That's the blue line. Fell from about 29% in 1990 to about 20% in 2010 and stayed there. If you'll excuse me, my lights just went off. And if you look at R&D that businesses paid for themselves, the fall is even steeper. The graph on the right tells the same story. That's the graph I began this talk with, that scientific publications have steadily declined, whereas patenting has not. In summary, corporate research now is less R and more D. Corporate R&D is now less R and more D. Now, this could be, one reason this could have happened is if corporate research became less valuable, less useful. But that's not the case as best we can make out. If you look at the graph on the top left, that shows 2 things. The line shows the percentage of articles cited by US patents. And this is a pretty, maybe it's modestly increasing, it's certainly not decreasing. It shows about 2% of all science and engineering articles are cited in US patents. And this has been the case between 2003 and 2016. So as best we can make out, a steady fraction of the articles produced, and by the way, during this time, the number of articles produced has expanded greatly, about 2% are cited by patents. If you look at the bars, that tell you the percentage of US patents that cite science and engineering articles, and that has increased quite dramatically. Now, there's something funny about 2012 because the NSF changes data vendors, but other data I've analyzed show a similar increasing trend. There's a steady increase in the citation of patents made by patents to science and engineering publications. The takeaway is that invention continues to use science, arguably at an increasing rate, or science continues to be ever more useful in invention. But the second graph shows you something different. It shows you and the way we estimate is we regress the market value of publicly traded companies on public and patents. And we divide this into 2 periods, 1980 to 92, and then 1993 to 2006. And if you remember, our data showed that companies started to withdraw from science sometime in the late 1980s. Between 1980 and 92, publications contributed positively to the value of a firm. So the coefficient here is 0.014. The way to interpret that is all else being the same, a company that doubled its stock of publications, that had twice the publication stock, would be 10% more valuable on the stock market, holding everything else constant, its book value, its R&D stock, everything else. During this time, patents are not that valuable, or whatever value they have is already captured by other assets. When you go to the next period, the situation is very different. Between 1993 and 2006, now publications don't contribute to value, but patents have a 4% elasticity of R&D. That is to say, a firm with twice the patent stock would be 4% more valuable on the stock market, holding everything else constant. And the takeaway here is, during this time when science continues to be useful in terms of contributing to invention, its private value has fallen. Put differently, science remains useful, but extracting profits from it turns out to have become more difficult. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and one exception that's frequently pointed out is AI or machine learning. And indeed, companies appear to be investing in research here. And this borrows on a study by Hartman and Henkel, who showed that whereas fewer than 15% of papers in the top machine learning conference were corporate authored, this share has nearly doubled in a span of about 10 or 11 years. And this remains true, this increase in share of corporate publications remains true even when we look at the top cited publications. Now, there are some interesting reasons why machine learning is an exception, and we can talk about that in the Q&A after this talk. So the next question is, well, why did companies withdraw? And once again, there is no dearth of explanations or potential explanations. Many people have pointed to growing competition. Others have pointed to growing monopoly power. So two very different ends of the spectrum. Some others, so Nick Bloom and others have argued that ideas are becoming harder to find, that it's becoming harder and harder to make those breakthrough discoveries. Yet others are blaming financial markets or short-termism on the part of the investors. I think there's potential merit in many of these explanations, but what I want to do is connect this decline to how the innovation ecosystem itself has changed. And in particular, I want to point to the changing role of universities and the contributions they're making. And second, to the market for technology. If you remember, I began this talk by pointing out the robust market for technology in late 18th century American economy, late 19th century American economy. And I'm going to show you some data to suggest that we may be getting back to that kind of an innovation system where firms are relying on outside sources. And in particular, now universities are an important source of this outside knowledge. So more concretely, what I'm suggesting is that the innovation ecosystem in America has changing. Some important elements of that are a division of labor where firms look to the outside for innovations and inventions as they did more than 100 years ago. That there is a market for technology that is supporting this division of labor between firms on the one hand and universities and startups on the other. And perhaps there's greater technical competition among firms, which is making firms more acutely focused on monetizing their research. They are less content as, unlike the firms in the 1920s, to have their research spill out to others, including their competitors. One other aspect which I will mention, I won't feature in this talk, but I will mention, is that managing research is also a significant challenge to corporate investment in research. This is an ongoing area that I think needs more research. We need careful studies of how firms such as Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Merck, Pfizer, and GM are managing their research and how their R&D management strategies are conditioned by the outside environment that they are faced with. Um, so let me now spend a few minutes describing this changing innovation ecosystem. As I'd mentioned, I submit to you there's a new division of innovative labor with universities and startups on the one hand. One big difference between the 1880s and the 2020s is the role of universities. Um, the top chart here shows that universities are playing an increasingly important role, not just in producing knowledge, but also in directly trying to monetize it. So first, it shows a steady increase in research expenditures by universities. That's that's the uh, that's the bar graph. It also shows at university. So the red line shows per R&D dollar, 10 million of R&D. Academic R&D in 1991, which more than doubled to about 18 patents per $100 million in 2013. During this time, if you did the same calculation for the economy as a whole, patents per R&D declined quite steadily. And the bottom graph shows the increasing importance of venture capital, because one way universities commercialize their research partly is through licensing, but also by spinning off startups. And venture capital plays an important role in supporting some of those startups and getting them to commercialization and scale. To support this division of labor, we have an active market for technology where technology itself becomes a tradable asset. So the table on the top is based on confidential IRS data that was analyzed by researchers from the US Census Bureau. They calculated that in 2002, US corporations earned about 66 billion in revenue from licensing intellectual property protected as industrial property, that is to say, technology licensing. By comparison, in 2002, US R&D, business R&D was about 194 billion, and spending on basic and applied research in the same year was 32 billion. In 2011, US corporations earned 111 billion through as licensing revenue. And during this time, during the same year, business R&D was 294 billion, and business expenditure on basic and applied research was 47 billion. One way to summarize this is licensing revenue earned by US corporation was about a third of their total R&D expenditures and about double what they spent on basic and applied research. And you can see other manifestations of these markets for technology. The graph on the bottom right shows contract R&D as a share of total R&D, and that has trended up between 1993 and 2007. And the graph in the bottom left shows you something really interesting. The R&D magazine awarded the top 100 innovations in a year, and fewer than 20% of these awards involved a collaboration between organizations in 1971. By 2006, over 2/3 of the awards involved a collaboration. The picture that emerges from all of this is what? Is first there's the division of labor, which, and to support that, you need licensing, you need acquisitions, you need JVs and collaboration. And this is indeed what the data show. And during this time, as you might imagine, the federal government reversed its long-standing position of supporting long-term research, particularly through agencies such as the Department of Defense, and stepped back. And you can see that federal government support for R&D has moved away from long-term blue sky research towards much more applied. And you can see that in who's spending this. Agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, which are now important funders of R&D in America, are now funding much more short-term oriented R&D. So before I get to what we're missing, let me just recap. I'm suggesting to you that the withdrawal of companies from research is connected to changes in the ecosystem. In some sense, we're going back to the past where companies relied on outside sources. The outside sources have changed. They're not just independent inventors and tinkerers, but now instead, importantly, are universities and university-based startups and other types of independent suppliers of technology. There are many reasons why this might be good. There are uh, lots of benefits to specialization and division of labor. Indeed, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations starts with a description of why countries are rich. And the key reason in Adam Smith is specialization and division of labor. So there are reasons to believe that this might not be altogether a bad thing. However, the question is, what is the current division of innovative labor that we're seeing? What are we missing? What are the gaps? And I would suggest that there are two potentially important gaps. One is in terms of sectors, that the new system seems to have left a gap in what might be called hard tech, or as some call it, preferred deep tech, which include areas such as quantum computing, new semiconducting materials, energy storage, biofuels, and ag tech. These are just some of the examples. So the idea is that the new system seems to be particularly good at, in some areas, software and life sciences are two important ones, but not as productive or not as responsive in other sectors. And the second is related to this, which is that corporate research is different in some ways from the kinds of research that you might see in universities. And in particular, corporate research is often mission-oriented. It has higher scale. It tends to be architectural in scope and is often multidisciplinary. And what that means is that university research may not always be a good substitute for what was going on in corporate research labs. So let me give you an example of what I mean. Consider the Google Translate project, which was a very significant accomplishment, as we all know. Now, to pull this off, you needed linguists, machine learning experts, statisticians, software engineers to translate the algorithms into code, database experts, and interestingly, hardware designers and engineers. In fact, Google Translate would have been very difficult to pull off without dedicated microprocessing devices, or what is called TPUs, or tensor processing units, which were customized for the job and which were developed by Google engineers. And in addition, you needed scale. Google used a data set of over, so that's for Google Translate. If you go to the picture on the bottom left, that's the famous Google CAT paper, which was about image recognition. And Google used a data set of over 3 million images and 375 million labels. By contrast, the public data set released by Stanford, ImageNet, had just 1 million labeled images. To give you another example of scale, Google employs 1,700 AI researchers. A quick back of the envelope calculation suggests that Duke University's computer science department and electrical engineering department, faculty and graduate students combined don't even come close. They're probably around a fifth of that. Another example of scale and multidisciplinarity, the Google Translate paper, which is the top left, shows the title and the abstract, has 32 authors. The CAT paper author team, which is in that photograph below, has 17 authors. Most university teams are smaller. If we look at the top 5 machine learning conferences from 2011 to 2018, corporate publications had 4.3 authors. University publications had 3.3 authors, and they have much greater impact. The point, I could go on, but the point here is corporate research is different in some important respects. And so university research is unlikely to be a perfect substitute. So in conclusion, large corporations are withdrawing from science. And although it's tempting, there's little point in hankering for the past, gold and otherwise. Corporate research, as I've argued, arose in response to specific historical circumstances, a growing market, an emerging economy, weak universities, and tremendous scientific and technical opportunities. Many of those conditions no longer apply. Not surprisingly, the system is changing. This new innovation system has a great deal of promise. What we need is a better way to harness today's scientific advances. We can talk more about this, but let me throw out a few ideas. We need more support for the hard sciences beyond AI. We need support in materials, energy, bioengineering. We need the government to enact policies that will create the demand that will provide the signals to the entrepreneurs and the investors that are so important in this new innovation system. And universities need to understand that their mission has to include better links to translation for their research to make an impact, not just simply to produce papers. And part of that is that aspiring graduates and postdocs who want to be entrepreneurs, who want to transform both the world of bits and atoms, need support, and they perhaps need better defined career tracks. And finally, I think in terms of corporations, we need some more imagination from managers on how they can manage research inside companies. And last of all, we need to embrace as a society to go back to the belief that progress can only come through greater scientific advance, that's the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Arora. That was a fabulous talk. Let me just see here. I'm hoping that I can, yes, there we go. So we've had one question so far from the audience. I hope we have some more, but I encourage people to put in their questions. You've given us a lot to think about, but I'm going to start us off with some questions. And first of all, your challenges that you've posed on how we address this gap and what the US and other national innovation policy programs can do, regional innovation policy programs as well can do to try to increase the translational capabilities of universities, to try to simulate some of the best of the golden age of corporate research in terms of what you mentioned about interdisciplinarity, mission-oriented research, the size of the teams that are working together. can you give us some thoughts on any types of policies or programs or exemplars that start to address some of this gap?
So that's a great question. Let me back up by saying universities tend to be somewhat conservative, which is perhaps surprising to people who are not in universities, but should not be surprising to anybody in a university. So change is difficult. But there are some interesting examples. There is this interesting postdoc program started at Berkeley called Cyclotron Road. I think some of you may have heard that. And the idea there is to provide career tracks and support for postdocs who have interesting ideas and interest in taking those ideas to the next stage, but they're simply too early for private capital. And the government can play a very important role. The issue with government money is, of course, how do you find and select and support people? And so I think the cyclotron road is an interesting example, and there may be others that people in our audience or you yourself may be familiar with. On the company side, I think this is really a call for more research to understand how companies are dealing with this problem of managing research. And if you look at the history of Google and Google X, you can see a lot of backing and forthing. On the one hand, Google was, for example, quite concerned that they did not want to replicate the problems that Xerox PARC had. So if you think of Xerox PARC was a spectacular success in many ways, but it's being held up as a poster child of the failure of corporate research, where research became disconnected with aims. And so you have a very interesting example or not interesting study of how a company is grappling with the problem of how to manage research. For example, they said, well, nobody's going to be allowed to stay at Google X for more than 2 years. You must leave after that. And this has some pros, but you can easily imagine the cons on this. And so there may be others. I believe I read somewhere about Genentech's program, and I don't know if I don't know a great deal, but you may.
Yes. So great example. So Cyclotron Road was also brought up in the keynote yesterday by Scott Stern, and also Elon Gur's current initiative with Activate. But Cyclotron Road, my understanding is that their great success has come through, to your point, making an alternative path for promising postdoctoral researchers who have a great idea that they've worked on in depth in their PhD in their lab, and want to have a couple of years where they're protected and they have a path that's recognized and doesn't, make their bet for the whole rest of their career. And that element of it, the paid postdoctoral research without the need to do it off the side of your desk, with the fact that you don't have to produce publications in their case, you just have to de-risk the technology, was the most important aspect, according to Elon Gur. More important than the access to the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab research equipment and people, and more important than the mentoring in their case. The case of Genentech is a very interesting one, and I think a great example. They probably also were actively looking at the case of Bell Labs and to say, how do we replicate what is good and mitigate the fact that it wasn't Bell Labs that actually profited? And and same with the Xerox PARC, that they're not the ones who profited from those inventions by not doing the last pieces of it. And so in Genentech's case, they have a 4-year postdoc program where they've limited it, and it has an end, and about 50% of those postdocs, my understanding, get hired on to Genentech as senior scientists. They always protect the program with about 10% of their R&D budget, no matter what else is going on, that's protected. And they forbid people from working on their current product lines but they integrate them into the existing research labs. They're still supervised by senior supervisors, so that those ideas are infiltrating. It has to be blue sky. And their reward metric of success is all top impact publications. So to the points that you made throughout your presentation, they're really trying to emulate that. I also noticed when we went down, I took a class of MBA students down to look to have a day at their corporate research labs and also tour their pilot scale-up facility. And their VP research said the way he described the way they fund their R&D, it was a lot like real options stage gating process into what they took forward and what they funded. He didn't like that language, but but that's certainly how it seemed to me. So a very interesting model, and telling that when Roche acquired Genentech, they closed their own R&D facilities and left Genentech's open. From the, sorry, another question posed here. Do you want to comment on those points, or do you want me to ask you this question from the audience?
No, I think let's take the questions from the audience.
Okay, so this one is from Jeremy Klein, and he comments that it's fascinating that crowdsourcing innovation was happening over 100 years ago. He wants to ask, to what extent are the shifts you've been describing a consequence of changes in the resource requirements for R&D in the different areas of science and technology that are of most commercial interest at any one time? Chemicals and computer hardware requiring massive resources compared to, say, app development. So that's one question there.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and I've struggled with it. How much of this change was was a result of the importance of different fields? I think there's certainly something to be said for that developing, there's a reason hard tech is called hard tech. It bits and atoms together requires more. I'll make 2 points. I think this is really important, but I don't think this is the only reason. So if you go back to the 1920s, and we'll take another example, petroleum refining. So the initial breakthroughs in petroleum refining came out of Standard Oil, but then the next two ones were independent inventors. The hydraulic cracking, which was the next big one, came out in sometime in the 1920s by a Frenchman called Houdry, who started the Houdry process. And after that, it was an independent startup that was competing with Standard Oil. And the startup's name is UOP, called Universal Oil Products. And they were supplying refining technologies to the independent refiners, i.e., which were not part of the Standard Oil group. And the reason this is interesting is if you look at today, something like 90% of refining capacity uses UOP technology. So it's possible for independent inventors and startups to innovate in new chemical processes, including petroleum refining. In fact, just to give one more example, when I went to graduate school in economics, I was a research assistant for a project that was funded by Ralph Landau, who was, an independent inventor. And Ralph made his money by developing innovative chemical processes and licensing them, and did well enough to endow a couple of buildings, one at MIT, one at Penn, and then the economics department at Stanford is now the Ralph Landau building. So it's possible. I mean, the requirements in the different fields are relevant, and certainly it's a lot easier to have a startup in software or to make an app, but compared to say ag tech. But I don't think that's the only reason for the change. So thank you for the question, Jeremy.
Do you think in the Wild West of some of the fields you mentioned, quantum computing for one, that there may be also the chance for independent inventors to have a role?
I think so. I think the question is whether in this innovation system, let me back up. And I think the current system with startups does very well dealing with either with technical uncertainty or with commercial uncertainty. So if you think about life sciences, it's all technical uncertainty. Will this molecule work? But if it works, we have a pretty good idea of how many people it would
Yes.
benefit and so on. If you think about software, it's mostly about commercial uncertainty. You can make the app. The key question is, will enough people want it? Will enough people use it? Can I find them in a cost-effective way? Both of these pure types, I think the current model with VCs and startups does well. I think what's different about the bits and atoms technologies is that you have both of these uncertainties. And that's when this new system that we have, the Division of Innovative Labor, seems to do less well.
Yes. Oh, that's a great answer. There's two questions we have come on here about universities and ways that we could change them and ideas. And I'm gonna read both of them to you and ask you to comment on them together. So one is from Jim McClellan at Queen's University, who's asking about impediments associated with current academic culture in terms of what is valued in peer assessment, put to practice, or innovation entrepreneurship activities. And the second is from, and apologies for pronunciation here, from Stin Keltermans, who asks, isn't part of the answer to deal with the gaps that universities should collaborate more to reach the necessary scale in certain areas? And aren't they already doing that in some instances by setting up inter-university, interdisciplinary research institutes?
So yes, thank you, Jim and Stin. Yeah, no, I think both are great questions. Let me take the second one first, because I think it relates to the first one as well. Yeah, so I think we've been talking about interdisciplinarity and the importance of interdisciplinary research and the importance of collaborating. So the NSF has been funding these centers, multi-university centers, for quite some time as well. I think it's fair to say that it hasn't worked well. That we've tried a lot of things. With some exceptions, I would say that these centers have not been spectacularly successful. I'm not an expert on this, more as an outside observer. My sense is that the way universities are set up and incentivized is perhaps part of the reason. So if you think about the standard model for academic success, it's the principal investigator-based model. You or I or Professor X applies for a grant from the National Funding Agency. When I've sat in these evaluation panels, we look at the PI, we look at the PI's publication record, etc. It's very much an individual investigator-focused approach. We typically have not funded teams, if you like, and there may be good reasons for that. We don't give a grant to Genentech's lab, for example, or we typically don't give grants to Duke's electrical engineering group working on robotics. We give it to Professor X or Y. And that's, there may be good reasons for that, but I think as long as we have that approach, it's going to be harder. And this may be a difficult problem to solve. And to go to Jim's point, I think about the impediments with the academic culture, I think it's related to that. We look at high impact publications. We have no real way of measuring impact in other ways. So in the end, while we'll pay lip service to multidisciplinarity or impact, in the end, it ends up being when we think about promotion and tenure cases, which is sort of the career track for professors, we look at what have they published, what were the outlets, how respected the outlets are, what's the impact factor. It's relatively rare to have an inquiry saying, okay, Alicia invented this, and as a result of this, a new molecule was discovered that resulted in the treatment and benefits to 5,000 patients. Now, in more clinical fields, I think you have patient groups that directly fund the research of individual PIs. So maybe that's a loop. But for those people to get where they are, to have the labs established, they have to have gone through the academic route and have been socialized and I guess indoctrinated in those academic norms. That so at the university I am, and at the universities I have been, we've spoken a lot about doing things and changing how we operate, and it's very difficult. I would say, frankly, it's very difficult.
So I think we'll have to leave that as a call for action. A call for action to be looking as university leaders and as members of university communities of different types of, and as researchers in this area, thinking about different types of impact measurements that we can propose, measure, champion, and try to get adopted by TPCs if we want to, if we want to address the gap that you are proposing in this very thought-provoking keynote speech today. So unfortunately, we're at the end of our time. So I want to extend a very loud virtual applause for a fantastic speech.
Thank you so much.
Very enjoyable. And
thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Well, thank you for really motivating a lot of thought and discussion amongst this community. And we're going to break now for 10 minutes and then go into 3 parallel track sessions. And if everybody would like to come back to their respective panel at our time, local time, 9:35. And once again, imagine a very resounding set of applause.
Thank you.